At exactly 3 hours 00 p.m. local time, the Caribbean looked almost too perfect. Flat seas, high sun, trade winds steady. For most ships, it would have been a routine afternoon. For the sailors on watch, the calm was a warning. On the radar screen's distant surface, contacts began to change. Courses adjusted, speeds increased. Bearings that should have stayed apart started to bend inward, not by chance, by design. One by one, multiple Venezuelan surface vessels, altered heading angling toward the projected track of an American carrier strike group, transiting legally through international waters. On the bridge, there was no panic. A carrier strike group never travels blind. Every mile of ocean is tracked, measured, and logged. Radar operators watch speed changes down to the knot. Combat systems teams recalculated intercept geometry in real time. What the Venezuelan ships were doing was subtle enough for deniability, but clear to anyone trained to read the sea. They were positioning to block, and blocking a carrier strike group is never an accident. At this distance, intent is written in math. A small course correction can be explained away. A sustained intercept vector cannot. As the minutes passed, the picture sharpened. If you want to see how moments like this really play out beyond the headlines, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer shadowing, they were probing the line. Testing how close they could get, how much pressure they could apply, and watching to see how the US Navy would respond. Still, the American formation held steady. The carrier maintained course. Escorts stayed in position, layered outward like a moving shield. No aggressive turns, no sudden acceleration. The message was quiet but unmistakable. We see you. Inside, the Combat Information Center systems shifted from routine monitoring to full recording posture. Every radar emission from the approaching ships was captured. Every maneuver was time-stamped. Optical sensors locked on, feeding high-resolution imagery to analysts who didn't need guesses, only facts. This was not about reacting fast. It was about reacting correctly. Encounters like this rarely aim for combat. They aim for something else. Friction, a headline, a moment that can later be framed as defiance or victory. Force the carrier to turn. Force a response. Force a narrative. But a carrier strike group is not a single ship that can be pushed aside. It is a system built to absorb pressure without breaking formation. The closer the Venezuelan ships moved, the more they revealed about their doctrine, their coordination, their confidence, and their limits. And the closer they came, the calmer the American response became. There were no threats broadcast over open channels, no dramatic warnings. Standard bridge-to-bridge hails went out, professional and precise, stating position, course, and the legal status of the transit. Silence returned in response. That silence said more than words ever could. By now, every sailor understood the weight of the moment, not because weapons were about to fire, but because this was exactly the kind of encounter where mistakes are remembered for decades. One miscalculation, one overreaction, one unnecessary escalation. That is how routine patrols become incidents. So the carrier strike group did what it was trained to do. It kept moving. The sea remained calm. The sky stayed clear. But beneath that calm, a line had been crossed, not by fire, but by intent. Venezuela had made its move, stepping directly into the path of one of the most disciplined naval formations on Earth. And from that moment on, everything that followed was being recorded. By 3:12 p.m., the pattern was no longer ambiguous. The Venezuelan ships had closed enough that their intentions could be measured, not assumed. Speed changes were consistent. Headings were deliberate. Instead of maintaining parallel tracks or wide shadowing arcs, the vessels were angling inward, cutting across projected paths, compressing distance, forcing geometry that left little room for coincidence. This was not routine presence. On American displays, the closest point of approach began to shrink. First 5 nautical miles, then 4. Each update came with a recalculation of time to intercept. The math was clean. If nothing changed, the Venezuelan formation would cross directly ahead of the carrier strike group within minutes. Still, the American ships did not maneuver. In naval operations, holding course can be the strongest statement possible. It signals confidence. It removes ambiguity, and most importantly, it denies the other side the reaction they may be seeking. The Venezuelan vessels, by contrast, continued to press. Radio silence persisted. No bridge-to-bridge coordination, no clarification of intent. For experienced watch officers, that absence spoke volumes. Ships operating professionally do not stay silent when distances collapse. Silence at close range is a choice. From the Venezuelan perspective, the move made sense. On paper, they could not overpower a carrier strike group. That was never the objective. The objective was friction. To force the Americans to adjust course, to create footage that could later be framed as resistance to show domestic audiences a navy standing up to a global power. But the ocean does not reward theater. It rewards discipline. As the gap narrowed, American escort ships subtly adjusted internal spacing. Not outwardly aggressive, but tactically precise. Sensors shifted priority. Surface search radars refined their focus. Electro-optical systems tracked hull numbers, deck activity, crew movement. Everything the Venezuelan crews did on deck was now visible, magnified, and archived. Every maneuver was logged inside the Combat Information Center. The atmosphere remained controlled. No raised voices, no rushed commands, just a steady flow of data bearings, speeds, emissions. Each Venezuelan ship was no longer just a contact. It was a profile, and profiles tell stories. They revealed hesitation in formation, keeping minor speed mismatches, small course corrections that suggested uncertainty, not confidence. This was not a rehearsed block by a navy accustomed to operating near peer forces. This was pressure applied carefully, cautiously, with an eye always on how the other side might react. The carrier strike group's response did not change. Standard maritime warnings were transmitted clearly, calmly, and legally precise. International waters, lawful transit, maintain safe distance. The messages were professional, recorded, and unambiguous. No reply. At 3:21 p.m., one Venezuelan ship surged ahead of the others, briefly increasing speed beyond the formation average. It was a probing move, a way to see if the Americans would flinch, if the carrier would turn, if escorts would reposition visibly. They did not. What followed was the quiet moment where the balance began to shift. Because pressure only works when the other side reacts. With every minute that passed, the Venezuelan ships were expending fuel, revealing operating limits, broadcasting emissions, and committing themselves deeper into an encounter they could not control. The Americans, meanwhile, were gathering information without giving anything away. This is the asymmetry modern naval power is built on. You do not need to fire to win an encounter. You only need to remain composed long enough for the other side to expose itself. At 3:28 p.m., the geometry finally stabilized. The Venezuelan ships held position just short of the intercept line. Close enough to claim presence, not close enough to risk collision or escalation. It was a pause, but not a victory, because by then, the block had already failed. The carrier strike group had not altered course. It had not slowed. It had not acknowledged the provocation beyond standard procedure, and in doing so, it denied Venezuela the single thing the maneuver was designed to create: leverage. What remained was an awkward standoff. One side steady and silent, the other committed but unsure of what came next. And in naval encounters like this, uncertainty is dangerous. Because once pressure stops producing results, the only options left are escalation or withdrawal. And Venezuela was rapidly running out of room for both. By 3:30 p.m., the encounter entered its most critical phase. Not because weapons were being armed, but because intent was now unmistakable. This is where less disciplined forces make mistakes. The U.S. Navy did not. Across the carrier strike group, posture shifted not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. Combat systems moved from monitoring to prioritization. Sensor tasking tightened. Data feeds were cross-checked and time synced. What looked calm on the surface was beneath the decks, a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. Watch everything. record everything. Give nothing away. The carrier maintained course and speed. Escorts held formation, their spacing deliberate, their silhouettes unchanged. There was no sudden maneuver that could be framed as intimidation, no visible escalation that could be misread. The message was restraint, but restraint backed by total awareness. That distinction matters because restraint without capability is weakness. Restraint with capability is control. As the Venezuelan ships lingered near the intercept geometry, American sensors quietly took the lead. Surface search radars refined resolution. Electro-optical systems locked onto bridge wings, mass arrays, and deck activity. Electronic warfare teams logged emissions, frequency, power, duration. Each radar sweep from the Venezuelan vessels added another line to a growing file. In modern naval operations, information is leverage. The U.S. Navy was collecting it in bulk. At 3:34 p.m., an American helicopter lifted off the deck of an escort ship. The launch was smooth, unhurried, and unmistakably professional. No low passes, no aggressive banking, just a controlled climb and a steady approach toward the contact area. From the Venezuelan perspective, the meaning was clear eyes were now overhead. The helicopter maintained safe altitude and distanced its presence non-provocative, but impossible to ignore. Its sensors, however, were anything but passive. Infrared systems tracked engine heat and wake turbulence. High-definition optics captured deck movement in real time. Every frame was geo-referenced and time-stamped. This was not a show of force. This was evidence collection. Standard warnings were broadcast again, measured, precise, and recorded. International waters' unsafe maneuvering maintained distance. The tone never changed. Calm, professional, final. The Venezuelan ships responded not with words, but with hesitation. Speeds fluctuated slightly. Course lines softened by a few degrees. Deck activity slowed. These were small details, but in close encounters, small details reveal state of mind. Confidence holds steady. Uncertainty wavers. And the American formation remained unchanged. No one raised their voice. No one rushed the moment. Because the U.S. Navy does not operate on emotion. It operates on doctrine. And doctrine says that the longer you remain predictable, the more pressure shifts to the other side. By now, the Venezuelan crews were boxed into an uncomfortable reality. They had committed to the maneuver far enough that disengaging would look like backing down. But pressing closer would risk crossing a line carrying consequences they could not control. This is the trap of brinkmanship at sea. You move forward for effect. You pause for reaction. And when the reaction never comes, you are left exposed. Fuel-burning sensors, emitting crews on edge, leadership, waiting for a moment that never arrives. Inside the American Combat Information Centers, there was no debate, no speculation. Everything that mattered was already being captured. The encounter was no longer about who blocked whom. It was about who retained freedom of action. And that answer was already clear. At 3:42 p.m., the Venezuelan lead ship began a gradual reduction in speed. No announcement, no acknowledgement, just a subtle easing back from the line it had pushed toward minutes earlier. The helicopter maintained its orbit. The escorts maintained formation. The carrier maintained course. No victory declarations, no radio triumph, just professionalism doing its work. Because the most decisive moments in naval encounters rarely look dramatic. They look controlled, measured, almost boring to the untrained eye. But every sailor involved understood exactly what had happened. The block had failed, not because it was challenged, but because it was ignored. And in the calculus of modern naval power, that is often the most decisive response of all. By 3:45 p.m., the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Venezuelan maneuver had reached its limit, not because the U.S. Navy forced it to stop, but because it stopped producing results. And that is where the mistake became clear. Blocking only works if the other side reacts. The Venezuelan plan depended on pressure-creating movement. A turn, a slowdown, a visible adjustment that could later be framed as success. But the carrier strike group never gave them that moment. No course change, no hesitation, no escalation. And in refusing to react, the US Navy flipped the encounter on its head. From that point forward, every additional minute favored the Americans. Fuel consumption mounted on the Venezuelan ships. Their formation discipline loosened. Minor inconsistencies appeared. One vessel lagging another, edging too far ahead. These were not dramatic errors, but they mattered. They revealed the limits of coordination and endurance under sustained tension. More importantly, the Venezuelan ships had already crossed the most dangerous threshold of all. They had exposed themselves. Every radar sweep, every engine surge, every deck movement had been captured, cataloged, and archived. What began as an attempt to create a political image had turned into a live demonstration of Venezuelan naval behavior under pressure. That data does not disappear. It is studied, compared, filed alongside previous encounters, used to refine future predictions about how a force moves, hesitates, and ultimately disengages. This is where the strategic miscalculation becomes undeniable. Venezuela never intended to fight, but by stepping too close, they allowed themselves to be measured against a force designed not just to deter, but to learn. The longer they remained in proximity, the more they gave away, without receiving anything in return. The carrier strike group, meanwhile, had lost nothing. Its formation remained intact. Its mission continued uninterrupted. Its crews operated well within doctrine, creating no footage that could be spun, no reaction that could be exaggerated. From a legal and operational standpoint, the Americans were exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what international law allowed. And that asymmetry is fatal to brinkmanship. Because when one side is acting and the other is simply recording, the actor always loses leverage first. At 3:51 p.m., the Venezuelan ships began to drift outward, not sharply, not in retreat, but enough to break the geometry of the block. Speeds normalized. Courses widened. The intercept line dissolved quietly, almost awkwardly. There was no announcement of disengagement, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred, but everyone involved understood the meaning. The maneuver had failed not with a confrontation, not with a warning shot, but with silence. This is the paradox of modern naval power. The most powerful response is often the least visible. It does not shout, it does not threaten. It simply removes options from the other side until only one remains. In this case, that option was disengagement. The Venezuelan crews were left with footage that showed ships approaching and then easing away. No American turn, no forced reaction, no moment of triumph. Whatever message was intended for domestic audiences now lacked a conclusion. The US Navy, on the other hand, walked away with something far more valuable than a headline. It walked away with clarity. Clarity about Venezuelan tactics, about command confidence, about how pressure is applied, and how quickly it fades when not reinforced by capability. That is the real cost of this encounter. Because future confrontations will not start from zero. They will start from what was learned here. And every move Venezuela made during this block attempt will be remembered not as a show of strength, but as a case study in overreach. By the time the Caribbean returned to stillness, the carrier strike group was already miles beyond the point of contact, steady on course, mission intact. The Venezuelan ships remained behind, scattered and silent, with nothing to show for the risk they took. And that is why this was a mistake. Not because Venezuela challenged a carrier strike group, but because they challenged it without understanding what happens when you apply pressure to a force that does not need to respond to win. By 4:00 p.m., the encounter was effectively over. The Venezuelan vessels had fallen back far enough that the geometry no longer mattered. Distances widened. Bearings stabilized. What remained on American radar screens was no longer a challenge. Just background traffic fading into the routine flow of the Caribbean Sea. The carrier strike group never slowed. From the deck of the carrier, nothing looked unusual. Aircraft continued their cycles. Watch teams rotated as scheduled. The ship's massive hull cut forward through calm water, steady and indifferent to what had just unfolded miles behind it. That was the point for the US Navy. The measure of success was not domination, but continuity. The mission was never interrupted. No deviations were required. No emergency posture was declared. The strike group moved on exactly as planned, leaving behind an encounter that would not make noise, but would make sense to those who understood it. Because the real aftermath did not happen on the ocean. It happened in the data. Every sensor log, every radar return, every optical frame captured during the block attempt was already being compiled, cross-referenced, and analyzed. Not emotionally, not politically, professionally. Patterns were identified. Maneuvering behavior was mapped. Reaction timelines were measured down to seconds. This is how modern naval power compounds its advantage, not through spectacle, but through accumulation. For Venezuela, the immediate outcome was uncomfortable. There was no footage of an American retreat, no dramatic confrontation to broadcast, no clear narrative to declare victory. What remained was silence, an absence of resolution that made the entire maneuver difficult to explain. And silence in these cases is rarely neutral. It leaves questions unanswered. It invites scrutiny. It exposes intent without payoff. For the U.S. Navy, the outcome was simpler. Another transit completed. Another encounter documented. Another demonstration that restraint, when paired with capability, is not passivity. It is dominance exercised quietly. This distinction matters far beyond the Caribbean because naval encounters are not isolated events. They are reference points. Each one shapes expectations for the next. Every action or refusal to act sets a precedent that other commanders, other governments, and other crews will remember. What Venezuela attempted that afternoon was not unprecedented. Smaller navies have long used proximity and pressure to test larger forces. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it provokes an overreaction. Sometimes it creates the image it was designed to produce. This time, it did none of those things. Instead, it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding. You do not measure power by how loudly a force responds. You measure it by how little it needs to. The carrier strike group did not turn. It did not threaten. It did not escalate. And in doing so, it left Venezuela with only one option that avoided risk, backing away quietly without acknowledgement. That outcome sends a message more durable than any broadcast. It tells future challengers that pressure without leverage collapses quickly. That proximity without capability only benefits the side that is prepared to wait. And in encounters like this, the most dangerous moment is not when weapons are armed, but when one side realizes the other never needed to. As the sun continued its slow descent over the Caribbean, the sea returned to the appearance of calm it had worn all day. To anyone watching from afar, nothing had happened. But to those who were there, to the sailors tracking the geometry, the analysts reviewing the data, and the commanders weighing the implications, the lesson was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy did not win by force, it won by discipline. And for Venezuela, that is the hardest kind of defeat to explain.